Been waiting for this for about a year and a half, and we're just about 7 or 8 months away from seeing how it all plays out. BYU, Cincinnati, Houston, UCF going to the Power Five in the Big 12. How will they fare? Got Steve Helwick on the line from SB Nation. You can catch his work on Hustle Belt and also Underdog Dynasty. Hey, Steve.
It's exciting to be back on and talking about college football again. These schedule releases are nice because it fills some time during a long off season.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the Big 12 versus these four. But before we really dive into that, let's just look at each team and what they've got coming back and how you see this playing out. Cincinnati, of course, last season under Luke Fickell, they finish at 9-4 after Fickell leaves, and they lose a bowl game to Louisville. Emory Jones comes in from Arizona State to cause quite a interesting quarterback battle with Evan Prater and Ben Bryant. How does Cincinnati shape up for you?
Cincinnati's probably the team I'm the least high on, which makes sense considering the massive turnover that they've had, not only in coaching personnel, but on the field. They were super deep on that 2021 team that reached the playoff. They went undefeated, beat Notre Dame, hung with Bama for 2 quarters in that playoff game before bowing out 27-6. But Cincinnati last year was more top heavy. They didn't have as much depth, and that showed when the injuries struck later in the season. And now that top part of the depth chart is going to the NFL. They have a very impressive squad going to their pro day this year, and they don't really have enough experienced returning guys, I think, to replicate that production, especially when you're upgrading conferences. So I do have my concerns about Cincinnati, not only just losing Luke Fickell, but losing a lot of the talent that they had on the field. Ivan Pace, he was probably as impactful as any defensive transfer last year. Came in from Miami, Ohio, was an All-American, was probably the best pass rusher, tackles for loss guy in the league, just invading the backfield. So Ivan Pace is a big loss that they have, and they have losses all around. Basically, their entire receiving core is gone, and we saw that in the Fenway Bowl, a preview of what the offense looked like without a lot of these guys transferring because Luke Fickell switched jobs or guys going to the NFL. And their offense was pretty pitiful that game. So they're going to need to restock a lot with transfers, which they have done already. They already have possibly 3 starters on the offensive line stemming from the transfer portal. And they got a lot of receivers coming from other places too. Donovan Ollie from Washington State, D. Wiggins, former Louisville receiver, just to name a few. So they're restocking that offense through the transfer portal. And then you mentioned Emory Jones. Emory Jones is in a logjam quarterback battle there with Ben Bryant and Evan Prater. Last year, Ben Bryant and Evan Prater battled for the starting job heading into week 1. Ben Bryant won the job, and throughout the season, he looked like the team's best quarterback. They really struggled when Ben Bryant had a season-ending injury in a November game against Temple because Evan Prater was a quarterback that they sent out for the Tulane game, which they needed to win that game to make the AAC championship. They did not. And for their bowl game in the Fenway Bowl against Louisville, Evan Prater kind of struggled as a passer on those. He still has room to grow. I think Ben Bryant's probably the safer option, even if Prater might have more upside of those two. But then you throw Emory Jones in there. And Jones last year, he had an okay start at Arizona State. They eventually went with Trayson Bourget later in the season. That's Trenton Bourget, his brother at Arizona State. And I just don't know. Emory Jones has that running threat that Ben Bryant doesn't have. As Ben Bryant had negative rushing yards last year, only had 1 run over 10 yards. Emory Jones, we've seen him run for almost 800 yards in a season before. So it's going to be what does Scott Satterfield want to see in his offense. And they just got a new OC from Virginia Tech. So it's a matter of what Satterfield wants in this offense. And it's going to be a different season, some trying times, I think, for Cincinnati as they enter this rebuild.
Of course, then we've got UCF. Gus Malzahn has had a decent stay there at UCF. They're coming off a 9-5 season after losing the American Conference Championship game in a bowl game to Duke. Of course, he had his high points at Auburn. John Rice Plumlee back at quarterback. Javon Baker at wide receiver. An offense that scored 33 points per game. And a defense that held opponents just at about 23 points a game. So your thoughts about UCF coming into 23?
I really liked UCF at the start of last season. They had a 9-game streak of their defense holding teams to 20 points or fewer. finally got snapped later in the season. And at the end of the year, they just don't look like the same team on defense, especially when they were allowing 45 points to Tulane in that AAC championship. UCF does have some returning talent. They did lose a lot to the transfer portal as well. But this is a team that recruits and restocks well under Gus Malzahn. Malzahn has really reshaped recruiting at UCF. Landing 4 stars is now a commonplace in recruiting, and I think this move to the Big 12 and being the only Big 12 team in the Florida market is going to help for long term for their recruiting purposes and their transfer. Have a lot of SEC transfers on the roster. Javon Baker and Kobe Hudson, their top 2 receivers, came from the SEC last year. They did a really good job in that passing offense, led by John Rice Plumlee. And Plumlee's going to return. It wasn't always the most consistent quarterback, but when Plumlee was on, he was on. And he was as talented as most as rushing quarterbacks come in college football. We saw that in the first game with Tulane when he had a healthy hamstring, him running for about 180 yards and basically just gashing that Tulane defense, that same Tulane team that won the Cotton Bowl. So I thought that Plumlee, when he's on, is a very good dual threat quarterback, but he needs to fix some of his inconsistencies and mistakes that he showed in games last year, like the Louisville game and then like the Duke game, even though he was kind of nagging with an injury there. Defensively, I like some of their returning pieces on the front 7, especially the defensive line with Josh Celisar, Ricky Barber, and Anthony Maltavo returning. Those are guys that have been there for a few years. I think that they can win some of these physicality battles in the Big 12 with that defensive line. But I do have concerns about the offensive line because they're replacing a lot, and that offensive line did show struggles against Tulane in the AAC championship game last year, and I have some questions on how they're going to fare in Big 12 play. They are a team that's restocking through the transfer portal. They got Amari Kite from Alabama, which should really help bolster that line depth. And then UCF, they like to recruit a lot of speed, so that's what you're going to expect from the running back position. You have RJ Harvey and Johnny Richardson, a couple fast running backs, and those are the guys that you're going to need to bolster that offense in the Big 12 because they were a top 10 rushing offense last year. That's their identity under Gus Malzahn. It was more of a passing team, I thought, in the Josh Heupel era when we were seeing Dylan Gabriel sling it for 300, 400 yards a game. But now this is a team that really likes to run the ball. It reminds me of the Auburn teams that Gus Malzahn had when he had Nick Marshall at quarterback with John Rice Plumlee playing the role of Nick Marshall.
Steve, we got Houston coming off an 8-5 season. Of course, Dana Hokerson known for his offensive schemes. Clayton Tune at quarterback. Couple interesting transfers here. Running back Kyle Porter coming in from Texas, and Ayabi Anoma, the pass rush potential phenom who's made his way through Alabama and Michigan and other stops. Your thoughts about the Cougars?
Houston's an interesting case because they do lose the dynamic duo that really led the team last year, Clayton Tune and Tank Dell. We saw that in the bowl game, how valuable that connection was. Tune was one of the best quarterbacks in college football last year, atop those passing touchdown lists. And then you could argue that Tank Dell was the best wide receiver in college football last year. The amount of separation he was able to gain on his routes, just his creativity in running routes and his catching ability, even at 5'10", his ability to high point the ball, he was so vital to that team. Yet, I think receiver might be Houston's strong point this year because they have a lot of the returning cast with Joseph Manjack and Peyton Sawyer, but Matthew Golden, who is a true freshman last year, is someone who I see as a budding star. And Matthew Golden really came into his own at the end of last year. He had a 584 yards, 7 touchdowns, had a couple 100-yard games toward the close of the season. Not only do you have Golden, who was a 4-star true freshman last year, you have a couple more 4-star true freshmen coming in this year. And Houston really recruited well at receiver. And then they also got some transfer guys. They got Josh Cobbs, the number 1 receiver at Wyoming last year, and they got Stephon Johnson, who came from Oklahoma State. So I think this is a very crowded, impressive receiving room. Now, who's going to be the guy throwing to them? It'll be Donovan Smith, who is the Texas Tech quarterback who beat Houston last year. He also beat Texas. Donovan Smith, he was an MVP of the bowl game when Texas Tech routed Mississippi State in 2021. He is somebody who could sling it for 300 yards in a game. He has good scrambling ability to extend plays. We saw that against Houston last year. But you will get a few mistakes per game with him. He had a lot of multi-interception games. His last game against Kansas State was the one that ultimately did him in as his time as a Texas Tech starter. But I think he can still work really well in Dana Holgerson's offense. Holgerson likes a quarterback that has some scrambling ability. We saw that with De'Aaron King, who was his QB when he first got to Houston. Then Clayton Tune could run the ball pretty well. So I think that Donovan Smith fits the quintessential quarterback that Holgerson is looking for in Houston. I do have questions about the Cougars defense, though. The offense still looks in good shape, other than maybe the line. The line does return a lot of pieces, but it's going to be a little difficult against some of these Big 12 fronts, I think, than what Houston's used to. Alton McCaskill, who is a really strong-legged running back, great at breaking tackles, led all true freshmen in rushing touchdowns in 21. He returns after an ACL injury last year, so that's going to be a big pickup. And then you have Brandon Campbell, who was a USC transfer, who was basically their number one running back last year, also in that backfield. So I think Houston's good on running back. Defensively, they actually return a lot, other than DeAnthony Jones and Derek Parrish, their dynamic duo of pass rushers. Houston was Sack Avenue. They were a team that was able to invade the backfield. So that was kind of their MO on defense, led by their coordinator, Doug Belk. They still have some pieces in there, like Atlius Bell, Nelson Caesar on the defensive line. I just don't know if this is a team that can be top 20 in pass rush again next year, unless one of them has a breakout season like a DeAnthony Jones or Derek Parrish we've seen in the past. But the possibilities there. I do like Houston at linebacker, though. You get David Ogwegbu, who was Oklahoma's second leading tackler last year. You add it to another Oklahoma transfer in Jamal Morris, and then Malik Robinson, who had a season-ending injury last year. This is a team with a lot of experience at linebacker. Now, my biggest concern of the Houston defense was the secondary. They struggled against passing attacks last year. We saw E.J. Warner, true freshman in Temple, really have the game of his life against Houston. He had, I think, almost 500 passing yards in that game, 3 touchdowns without really any mistakes. We saw quarterbacks continually set season highs against Houston's secondary last year. Now, they do get Art Green, who only played 6 games last year, back from injury, had 10 pass deflections, but I do want to see more out of the Houston secondary because a lot of times the Big 12 is a passing league. You have quarterbacks like Dylan Gabriel in this conference. Texas will probably have a good quarterback, whether it's Quinn Ewers or Arch Manning there. You're going to have some guys in this league that can throw for a lot of yards. So I think that Houston really needs to shape up the secondary if they want to be competitive in this Big 12.
On to BYU, Steve. And of course, Kalani Sitake is the latest in very long tenured coaches at BYU. They hold on to these coaches, and obviously they're successful for long periods of time, coming off an 8-5 season. Keaton Slovis in via USC, then Pitt to make his bid to replace Jaron Hall at quarterback.
Yeah, Jaron Hall was quietly one of the best parts of, I'd say, just an above average season at BYU last year. We've seen better from them, like in the 2021. But Jaron Hall was very efficient last year. I thought 31 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. He was a lot of driving force of BYU's success, and they're going to need to replicate that with Keaton Slovis. Now, Keaton Slovis, we know what he's capable of. We saw what he did in 2019 when he replaced injured JT Daniels and led USC to a spectacular offensive season where he was looking like a future NFL draft pick. Had 72% completion that year, 30 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. But we haven't really seen that from Slovis since. Last year at Pitt was a very good team, 9-4. A lot of Pitt's success was Israel Anaconda in the running game, and then defensively Servosier Dennis and Kalijah Cansey, 2 guys that will make their name on Sundays very soon. Pitt wasn't really a stellar passing attack last year, so we need Slovis to get back to what he was at USC. Maybe he can rekindle that in a new setting in Provo. And I like his receivers. They lose their top receiver in Puka Nacua, but they still have 3 established receivers in Keanu Hill, Chase Roberts, Cody Epps. Not too much experience outside of those 3, but I think that trio can carry BYU's passing game alone. The running game, you lose Chris Brooks. You bring in Aiden Robbins, a 1,000-yard rusher from UNLV. BYU is usually a team that's very good in the trenches. So I think that will be a key to how they perform in the Big 12. They will replace 3 starters on the line, including All-American tackle Blake Freeland, who was one of the best linemen in all of college football last year. But I do like that they got Utah center Paul Maley, who started the majority of the season with the Utes last year. And the Utes, we saw their physicality in the Pac-12 championship game and what they were able to just assert on USC's defensive line. So getting a guy like Paul Maley, I think with a really physical Utah bunch, I think that's going to be a key addition to BYU in the transfer portal. And then defensively, I think BYU's strong suit there is their linebacking core. You have Max Tolley and Ben Bywater, 2 linebackers who I thought were really good in coverage last year, and they're going to return to the team. And you see a lot of 3-3-5 defenses in the Big 12. BYU is another team that runs a lot of 3-3-5, and then you have some good coverage linebackers there that can help stop some of these Big 12 offenses. I'm a little less high on BYU's secondary. Eddie Heckard, who is a FCS All-American, is really their only established cornerback, I think, at the moment. So I think that they need to work on some cornerback depth upcoming in spring football, refine that part of the game going into the season. But overall, I do like the shape of BYU. I mean, a lot of times when a team loses their number 1 QB, running back, and receiver, it's not a team that people are high on, but I still think that BYU has some of the returning pieces and transfer portal pieces where they can have a solid season in their first year in the Big 12.
Now, about how these 4 stack up against the Big 12. And especially with Cincinnati, UCF, and Houston, we've all seen the 3 of those schools basically take turns as the preeminent group of 5 school over the last 10 years or so. Of course, Houston about 10 years ago with their Peach Bowl win against Florida State, several successful seasons at Oliver and that group. Then we had, of course, Cincinnati being the most recent, UCF with back-to-back regular season undefeated campaigns. So there could be a selling point for each one of those 3. And probably over the long haul, BYU could argue that they've been the most successful. Now we translate, and I've looked at the numbers, 4 schools that have basically played roughly 500 football against Power 5 opponents over a long period of time, over the last 10 or 15 years, but having to play Big 12 caliber opponents year after year after year. Who do you think is best prepared when you look at these programs in 2023? And then long term, what would be your projection on success for these 4?
In 2023, I think it's between BYU and UCF. These are teams that have incumbent coaches. They have a lot of established pieces returning on both sides of the ball, I think. And I really like what they have in the trenches, whether offensively or defensively. And I think that's some of the key with the Big 12, because I think a lot of the AAC skill position players you can put up against any conference in college football. But I think it's what you have on the offensive and defensive lines and the linebacking core, front 7, which is where it really changes in upgrading to the Big 12. I mean, a lot of times I think the Big 12 physicality is underrated. We saw what TCU did to Michigan last year in the Fiesta Bowl. I mean, that was a very assertive performance from that offensive line in that game. And we saw Amari DeMarcado get so many holes in that game and run for so many yards. And we saw Max Duggan get ample protection a lot of that time. TCU had such a dominant offensive line in that game. And I think that a lot of these newcomers might not be prepared to have that on the offensive line just yet. But I think that BYU, knowing what they've done in the trenches the past few years, seeing the physicality that the team has, I think that BYU has kind of a Kansas State feel to it at times in how they're structured. So I think that BYU's most poised for success in 2023. You have a very veteran quarterback in Keaton Slovis. He's been through a few schools already. He's had success at USC. And then you have some established linebackers, Max Tolley, Ben Bywater, that I mentioned earlier. I think BYU's most poised for success in 2023. Skill position guys, UCF has the best skill position guys of any of these teams. UCF, they have Kobe Hudson, Javon Baker as a wide receiver. Xavier Townsend was really developing as a speed threat toward the end of last year. They have few established running backs that I mentioned, RJ Harvey, Johnny Richardson, who've been there for a few years. UCF loves to recruit on speed. They have track star guys a lot of times in the offense. We've seen some of the guys that have run through UCF at running back and receiver in recent years, guys like Gabe Davis and Marlon Williams and then Adrian Killens. UCF skill position guys are usually very well coached and they're very explosive. So I think UCF has it in skill position. And I think that's why they'll be able to succeed a bit in 2023. Now, Houston and Cincinnati are the teams that I have more question marks at. Houston, you lose your quarterback in Clayton Tune. You're getting a new QB in Donovan Smith. I need to see what Donovan Smith looks like in this Houston offense, especially without Tank Dell, who was Houston's saving grace last year. I know that he has a deep wide receiving core, and I'm very high on this receiving core, but how will Donovan Smith fare with it, and how does a Houston offensive line protect Donovan Smith? So those are my questions about Houston and the secondary. Cincinnati, I have a lot. Cincinnati, they replace so much of the team. Defensive line, they're still pretty strong, I think. They have Corleone still, Malik Van, Jawan Briggs. I think that their defensive line is pretty fortified still. And they have Deshaun Pace at outside linebacker. The rest of the defense, they're replacing so much. You don't have Arquan Bush there in the secondary anymore. You don't have Javon Hicks, who were their two best players, defensive backs last year. And then offensively, you lose a lot of the pieces on the offensive line, which was the one thing that they had retained from the playoff team to 2022. They had all 5 starters back. So you lose most of the offensive line, and you have to replace most of your receiving core and a whole head coaching staff. I think this is going to be a rebuilding year for Cincinnati, but I think that they might be able to get back there eventually. Then you just asked me about future. It's hard to project years out, I think, just because if you asked me in 2019 to predict the 2022 Big 12, I wasn't going to have TCU probably making the playoff 12-2.
Sure.
So I don't really know how I can project the future. All I know is that UCF and Houston, I think, are killing it in the recruiting department right now. They're starting to see 4 stars become more commonplace. They're doing well in the transfer market. I think those are teams that can really leverage where their location and the high school talent around them into long-term success. So that's the answer I'll give there.
That's exactly where I was going. That's exactly my thought. That doesn't mean that somebody can't go into Cincinnati and BYU and compete in the Big 12. That doesn't mean that UCF and Houston have a layup in terms of being competitive, but they've got that built-in advantage of where they're located. And now that they're in a Power 5 conference, it'll be interesting to see. And as you've mentioned, we've already seen indications of that recruiting elevation for being in a Power 5 conference. Steve Helwick, SB Nation, Underdog at Dynasty and Hustle Belt. Check out his work right there. Steve, we appreciate you stopping by and breaking things down for us.
Thanks. Can't wait for 6 months till now when we can finally see how these teams stack up.